Hey, my name is Maxim Ivanov, and 2 weeks ago I made a video about how to create a ReactQuery CRUD application, and a lot of you have been asking to show how to test ReactQuery based components. In this video we're gonna cover the update book page component with tests, and I've picked this particular page because it uses both the query to get the default values for the book and the mutation to update it. So it's the good case for testing. This tutorial is going to be based on the original video, so you might want to check it out as well. And now subscribe, press a like button, and let's go. In this video we'll write the test for the book update page. So if we click on the book title, we'll see the book form and the update book title. This is the updating the book page. And then when we click the submit button, we expect that the updated book information will be sent to the server and will get redirected back to the root page. Here is the update book component that is responsible for this behavior. This component depends on React Router DOM to perform the routing and to get the book ID from the params. This ID param is embedded in the URL. If we open the app.js and look at the update book route definition, you'll see that we use this placeholder ID here, and it is available to the update book page. We use the useParams hook from React Router DOM to get the ID from the URL. Then we also use the history object that we get using the useHistory hook, and we use it to navigate back to the root page after we've updated the book. And then we depend on ReactQuery first to get the default values for the book, the data that was written before, and then to mutate the book, to update the values. So we use a query and we use a mutation. Here you can see that we render different layout depending on the state of the query. So while it's still loading, we show the loader. If there was an error, we show an error message. And if everything is fine, we just render the book form, which we also use for the create book page. And also we render the title, update book. Let's begin by planning the tests. Inside of the update book folder, I'm gonna create a new file, update book spec.jsx. And then I'm gonna plan the tests. First, I usually write the root describe, and here I say what I'm gonna test. It's the update book component. Inside of it, we pass the callback. And then inside of it, I'm gonna write a bunch of other describe blocks for different initial states of this page. So for example, if the book is loading, this is the initial state. While loading, we render a loader component. So we can write describe while loading and pass a callback and say it to do. I'm using the to do function to skip writing the test itself for now. This way I only need to write the test name. And here it will be renders a loader. Then I know that we also need to process the error state. That's another initial configuration, which will imply that we get an error from the backend. So we add another describe with an error. We add a callback. And here we know that we need to render an error message. It to do renders an error message. And then the last case, when we have the data, we render the page title, which is update book, and the book form. The last state we want to describe is when we get the data. So we add a new block, describe with data, add a callback. First of all, we want to render the layout with the update book title and the book form, which is another component, and we're going to mock it later. It to do renders the update book title and the book form. If we go back to the component, you'll see that when we have the data, we also pass the onSubmit function to the form. And then when the form is submitted and this function gets called, we mutate the book. So we send the data to the server to update the values. And then we navigate back to the root page. So we also need to describe another thing that happens here, and it's on book form submit. So inside of the with data, so when we have the data for the book, we can also have the describe on book form submit. And then in this case, we expect that it will update the book data and navigate to the root page. It to do updates the book data and navigates to the root page. Now that we've planned the tests, we can start implementing them. Oh, and we also want to add another test that will be that the page fetches the book data for the given ID. In this test, we're going to check that the parameter, that we can get the ID parameter from the URL. So let's add another it to do. And we do it regardless of the loading, error, or with data state, because it happens before all of it. We just want to fetch the data. It fetches the book data for the given ID. If we go back to the component, you'll see that we have a bunch of dependencies. So first of all, we depend on React Router DOM because of the use params and use history. I think in this case, we probably will test it in integration. So we will actually use the React Router DOM context, the router provider, because we'll want to test the navigation later. But for the queries, we could actually wrap them into custom hooks because it would make it easier to mock them. Because what we want to get from them is just the data. A bunch of flags, for example, is loading and is error. And it's easier if we can just mock the return values of them. Let's do it. We're gonna create two new files, use fetch book.js and use update book, two custom hooks. One for the query, use fetch book, and one for the mutation, use update book. So create a new file, use fetch book.js, export const use fetch book. The function. We can copy the implementation of the use query here, paste it inside of the custom hook. We'll need to import the get book from the API. Import get book from API. And also we need to import the use query. Import use query from ReactQuery. After we have the data error is loading and is error flags, we can return them. Data error is loading and is error. Now we can easily mock it. Let's create another file. Use updatebook.js, export const use update book. It's a function. Here we also can copy the mutation call, paste it inside of the custom use update book hook, and we return an object with mutate async. We could actually rename it to something more specific to the book update, like update book maybe. I'm gonna keep it like this, and is mutating. Then we need to import the update book from the API and import use mutation from ReactQuery. Okay, now we can go to the update book component, and instead of using the use query calls, here we'll use fetch book, and we need to pass the ID. By the way, we need to update the hook then as well, ID, so we can use it inside of the query. And instead of using the mutation, we're gonna use our custom hook, use update book. And we don't need to pass the ID because we'll pass it to the mutator function along with the data. Okay, let's remove the imports that we're not gonna use anymore, and instead import use fetch book from use fetch book and import use update book from use update book. Before we go back to the tests, I propose we make a helper function that will help us render the component inside of the router. Go to the setup tests file, and here we can define a global helper, a function that will be globally accessible, without the imports inside of our tests. We do it like this. Global, it's a global object, like window in browser. Global is kind of the same global scope object in Node.js. Render with router is a function. We get the render component function instead of getting the component, because this way, if we get a function, it's easier to pass some additional props, to specify the specific props. If we would just pass the component here, it would be much harder. Then here we get the route, which is just a string, basically the URL which you want to start with when you test your component. And then here, first we get the history. We need to install the history package at this point. Yarn add history. After it's done, we use the function called create memory history. Import create memory history from history, and we call this function to get the history instance. Create memory history. We do it because we are running our tests inside of that node environment and it doesn't have the history object. Then if we got the route, it was specified when we were calling this function, then it means that we push it to the history push route, and we return an object where we combine all the return values of the render function from the testing library React. We need to import it. Import render from testing library React. So we call this render, pass through all the values. We use the spread operator. Here we render the router, pass the history that we've just created. Inside of the router, we render the render component function, render component, and then the second field is the history. So this function, render with router, will return everything that the regular render function would return, and also a history, the history object, that will allow us to check where are we right now, on what URL, to check, to test the navigation. We need to import the router. Import router from React router DOM. And we are done. Now we have a globally accessible function that will make it way easier to test something that depends on routing. Let's go back to the test. And we'll begin with the fetches the new book data for the given ID. Remove the to-do part, add a callback. So here we just call the render with router. As you can see, we don't need to import it because it's globally available. We pass in the render component function. And to be able to have the routing in place, we cannot just pass in the update book component. We need to wrap it into a route with a specific path. Because if you look at the app.js, the update book component only has the access to the ID because it's defined as a part of the path on the route that wraps it. So we need something like this inside of the test as well. So let's import route from React router DOM. And also we need to import the component. Import update book from update book. Now we can render the route. Path equals. It doesn't matter which path exactly are we using here. We just need to have the ID segment. And then we close it, and inside of it we render the update book component. Next we need to make sure that our useFetchBook hook was called with an expected ID. So for example, if we pass the initial URL as a second argument here, and it's going to be test book ID, then we expect that this value is going to be the ID field here, and it's going to be available through the use params. So we need to mock the useFetchBook hook. It's done like this: just mock, then we specify the name of the file, useFetchBook. Then we specify the module that it exports. UseFetchBook is a named export from it, so we specify it as a field on the object, useFetchBook, and we say that it's just fn. So it's a mock function, and later we'll be able to mock the specific implementation for each of the tests. For now, we can just define the before each function or callback, and mock the implementation of the useFetchBook mock implementation, and we pass a function that returns an empty object. Now inside of our test, we can expect that useFetchBook, and to be able to refer to it here, we need to import it. And we're going to import already mocked version of this module. Import useFetchBook from useFetchBook. Now we can expect that useFetchBook will be called to have been called with test book ID. Let's see why do we have an error here. And query clean, and you can see that the query client is not set. So the reason why are we trying to mock the hooks here is to avoid this error, because both of our custom hooks depend on ReactQuery, and ReactQuery depends on the query client, which is provided through the query client provider in our index file. And of course, we don't have it available in our tests. So we need to mock the use update book as well. Go back to the test and call just mock use update book. Pass a callback. We need to return an object because we use a named expert there as well. Use update book is just fn. We can mock the implementation of the use update book same way as we did for the use fetch book hook. Use update book. And we need to import it. Use update book from use update book. Okay, and the test is passing now. Let's see if we can break it. Test book ID, let's change it to foo, and the test should fail. Here we check that it correctly parses the URL and gets the book ID from it. Okay, we could break it. Now let's fix it back and continue. The next thing we want to test is that while loading, the update book component renders a loader. Let's remove the to-do part. And if you wonder how do I get these check marks, or for example, if the test is not passing the red crosses here, it's because I'm using the extension called Jest. So you go to extensions, look for Jest, and install this Jest from Orta. That's it. So let's continue. While loading, we want to render a loader. So first of all, we want to mock or remock the implementation of the use fetch book hook. Let's do it here. Use fetch book mock implementation. You can do it however many times you want to. For example, we can do it in every test here if we need. And we want to return a specific value for the isLoading flag, which is true. So if we're loading, then here we render the component with router again. We can copy it, paste it, and we need a const to store the get by test ID value. Why do we need the get by test ID? That's because this is the only way to find the loader. If we go to the update book component, you will see that the loader doesn't really have any text, or we don't really know what type of the element will it be. It's the library that we use here. It's the React loader spinner. And I decided to just add the data attribute, data test ID. And usually it's used to mark the elements that otherwise would be too hard to reach or too hard to find in your application layout. Let's call it loader. And now it's going to be easy to find it in our test. Go back to the test. We can get it by the test ID now. So we can expect that get by test ID loader, the one that we've just added, to be truthy. Format the document. The test is passing. Let's try to see it broken. Foo, and we wait, and it needs to fail. Okay. Now we need to check the error state. Again, remove the to-do. We're gonna mock another flag now. The isError. We can copy the implementation from the previous test, paste it in the renders an error message callback. But now instead of the isLoading flag, we're gonna say that isError is true. And also we're gonna set the error object. Error is an object with a field message saying something went wrong. Now instead of get by test ID, we get the container. It's the element which is the parent to all the contents of the component that we're rendering. And we expect that container inner HTML matches the text error something went wrong. So we basically test that we show the error message. Okay, we're getting an error and it seems like I made a typo. I've added the T letter where it shouldn't have been. Okay, and it works now. The last case, or the last two cases, are with data. First one is we check that we render the title and we render the book form. So for this test, we remove the to-do part again, so we can add the callback, and then the contents will be almost the same as for the error state, but instead of the error, we're gonna pass in the data. Let's remove the values, use fetchbook mock implementation, and now the data will be an object, and it doesn't really matter for this test in particular which data are we gonna pass. We just want to check that the update book page will pass the default values, the data that it got from the backend, as the default values to the form. And here it's gonna be foo bar. Then first of all, we wanna check that the text somewhere on the page will match the update book. Here we need the mock book form value to be able to check which props did it get. Let's scroll up and mock our component. Just mock. If we open the update book component, it is called book form. Here is where we pass the default values as the data that we get from the useFetchBook. So we go back to the test. We mock the ... shared book form. The book form is in the shared folder. Here it is, because we use it on the create book page as well. We pass in the callback that returns an object with the field book form, and it's just a fan. Now we can mock the implementation. By the way, we can add it here as well. Book form, mock implementation. We can remove null here because we cannot return objects from the React components. And we need to import book form from shared book form. Now we can scroll down to the last test, the one before the last, and expect that the book form to be called with. And here the first argument, we can check that the object that we pass, along with the isLoading flag and the callback function for form submission, also has the default values key. So we do it using the expect object containing, and here we pass an object that has the field default values, and we want it to have the foo bar value, the same as the data. And then we need to pass the second argument, which is an empty object. I believe in case of components, it's context values, and it passes. And let's try to change it to baz to see if it will still pass, or it needs to fail now. Okay, it worked. Change it back, and we have one test to cover. Remove the to-do, and here we need to check what's going to happen when we submit the form. Add the callback, and here we'll need to mock the implementation of the book form again. Now we want an interactive form. For example, we can add a button that on click will call the onFormSubmit function with the values that we pass to it. So book form mock implementation, we pass a callback, which is a component implementation in this particular case, and then it returns a layout with the button. The button says submit, and on click it's gonna call the function called onFormSubmit. Go to the update book component. You will see that we pass the onFormSubmit callback to this form, and then on click we call an inline function onFormSubmit, and we pass the values to it, foo bar. Now we can mock the mutate async because we need to check that the mutation function was called. Const mutate async equals just fn. Then we mock the implementation of the useUpdateBook. That's the function that returns the mutate async in our case, and we'll need to pass it as one of the return values of this hook. useUpdateBook mock implementation, and we pass a function that returns an object with mutate async. In this case, we don't care about the second value. It's the isMutating field. It's not as important for this test, so we focus on the mutation. Next, we need to render the component. Const get by text and the history object. We'll need the history to check if we perform the navigation. Equals render with rotor. We pass a callback, which is render component function, and it needs to return the same layout as previously. We can actually copy this part. Render with router, format the document. Okay, now we can fire the event. Fire event, click, get by text, submit. It needs to start with the capital letter because this is how the button is called, submit. And we need to import the fire event from the React testing library. Import fire event from testing library React. Scroll back down. After we click the button, first of all, we expect that the mutate async to have been called with, and it needs to be called with an object with a foo bar. And also, if we open the update book, we expect that it will be called with the data and the ID. So we go back to the test. We expect that the second field will have the test book ID value, because that's the ID that we get from the URL. Foo bar ID test book ID. We're getting an error here. What is going on? Unable to find an element with the text submit. And that is happening because it seems that the book form mock didn't work. And this is happening because I've added an extra inline function here. I need to remove it, format the document, and now the test is passing. But we need to add another check here that we've navigated to the root route. So we add an expect history. We got it from the render with router. Remember, we are returning it along with the render values. If we open setup tests, you will see that we return the result of the render by spreading it. And also we add the history object that we defined here. So we can use it to check on what page are we right now. So we expect that the history location path name equals root URL. We wait and we get an error. Let's see why. We're still on the test book ID page. And as you remember, when we were running the app, it was actually navigating. So what is wrong here? The problem is in the async action. So when we mutate the book, we do it using the async function, mutate async. So we need to wait until the history push actually happens, even if the mutate async resolves almost immediately. So we go back and we need to make the whole it block asynchronous. Async. Now we can use the wait for function. I wait for, and we pass a callback here. We need to import the wait for from the React testing library. Wait for, scroll back down, and put the expectation inside of the wait for callback and format the document. Okay, that's it. We've ended up with 2 additional hooks that allow us to abstract the communication with the backend. Let me know in the comments, do you want me to show you how to test those hooks as well? If you have any ideas for the next videos, let me know in the comments or join my Discord server where you can add your ideas. See you next time.